wants you. And as I was saying to someone earlier, I don't think people realize that Barbara is like the Darth Vader of the... Everyone is so scared of her. So they're like, whenever Barbara wants you, just go then. And so Barbara started emailing with Barbara, and she said, do you want to come on your publication week? And I said, oh, that'd be great. And she said, or we could throw you in with Jacqueline Winspear, which would be too late, but it would still be fun. And I said, oh my God, cancel all your plans. I really want to do that because I'm such a huge admirer of the Maisie Dobbs series. And so I am here, you know.
It's pretty lovely, isn't it?
So you're here as a fanboy, essentially.
Right, well, I don't know if I'd stipulate that, but I'm also here. This is my very last stop on tour after a long, I'm excited to go home. So,
How long have you been on tour?
On and I mean, it's just these annoying little 2-day or 3-day things, and then
On and on and on.
yeah, and sometimes it's like 120 people, and sometimes it's 13, and both are good, you know, both are nice, but this is the most exciting one because I love this store so much, and it's so close to my heart, and I'm such a fan of your work.
Thank you. Gosh,
So we should congratulate Jackie because this is her actual publication date for her 14th. And we go all the way back to your first Maisie Dobbs.
We do. When I had to beat down the aircraft door to get out. No, you think I'm joking. It's just, I've told this story so many times, but I don't know whether I had done one event there. I'd done one event. So I was still really scared about doing events. I mean, it was literally, I would come to do an event. I could see my shirt moving. My heart was beating so much. And anyway, I left plenty of time to get here, to fly from California, and the flight was delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed. And then we finally got in, and I thought, great, I'm going to make it by the skin of my teeth, and they couldn't get the aircraft door open. And all I wanted to say was just, would someone give me a crowbar, because I know I can get it open. And then the taxi driver didn't know the way here. It was purgatory. Barbara held the fort until I came flying in.
So how long did you have to vamp for? Were you?
Yeah, I don't remember, but I do remember after it was all over, Jackie came home to spend the night with Rob and me and our dog, who she bonded with, and later sent me a beautiful British Railway poster with a wire-haired fox terrier in it in tribute to our dog, who has left us since. And that's really the part I remember. I don't remember that you were particularly late to the event.
It was, and then when I got here, you went, oh, you're British. Yeah, that's me.
And in case
Can I tell you a story about that?
But let me just say this, in case you think that's completely inane, we have done events with Martha Grimes and Deborah Crombie and, Elizabeth George and all. None of them are British, but write British mysteries. So it wasn't really as weird a question as it sounds.
Well, I was going to say, I went to my local library when I moved to Chicago, and I handed over my new card, and the librarian said, oh, Charles Finch, there's a writer named Charles Finch. And I said, I think you might mean me. And she said, oh, no, he's British. And I said, I still think you might mean me. And she said, oh, no, he's this tall, handsome British. And I said, I think it's me. So I'm glad that we have an authentic Brit here.
Well, you almost count. You spent enough time there.
Yeah, that's right.
Honorary Brit. So
carry on.
Carry on.
Are we supposed? That's it. Just carry on.
I was going to leave you to flounder
She's just throwing us in the deep end. This is Barbara. In the deep end you go. Now talk to each other.
Well, we could talk about secondary characters, but probably it would be better if we started out just discussing the basic premise of each of your new books. So who wants to go first? You should, Jackie, because this is your publication.
Okay,
right?
and you know what you said earlier about, the time you see the author that they're working on something else and they've forgotten. Okay, so my new book is set in May 1940. And basically the premise is that Maisie Dobbs is investigating the disappearance of a young man. He's a young apprentice painter and decorator, and his company, the firm he works for, has landed a government contract to paint fire retardant on all Air Force RAF buildings and new airfield buildings around the British Isles. And so he's going from place to place to place putting this fire retardant on. And they've been worried. His parents have been worried about him, and Maisie talks to them, and anyway, she gets involved in trying to find out what's happened to him. And at the same time, there are a couple of other young men who are in her orbit that give Maisie and others cause for worry. And it also, if you know anything about May 1940, it was a time when Britain was very worried that there would be an invasion, and with good cause. And also the British Expeditionary Force was basically stranded on the coast of France in the area of Dunkirk. And I think that's all I'm going to say about that. That's the forest. Yes, so that's basically the premise.
It's so sad if you read Orwell's journals, because he was in charge of one of the home guards, and he says, we're up to 19 rifles, 3 functioning, with 1 sack of potatoes. And he was in charge of this little village's defense, and they thought that the Germans were coming any day, right?
Well, and with good cause. They really, it was really during the Battle of Britain that when that was Hitler's first sort of he thought he could just beat the heck out of Britain and then sail right in, and thanks to the RAF they taught him otherwise. The Luftwaffe losses were far worse than the RAF, and with the RAF with a much smaller number of aircraft overall. And in fact, the Home Guard, everybody sort of laughs about the Home Guard, especially because of Dad's Army. Has anybody ever here watched Dad's Army? It is. I can't believe it's only a few people. It was a British show that came out in the 1970s, and it was really a send up of the Home Guard. And so people get the picture of the Home Guard as being a whole load of buffoons, but in fact, they weren't. They weren't as silly as they were stupid looking on the TV. Actually, I was at school with this guy that his dad was in it, so we always used to watch it.
Well, and people were desperately trying to get into the army and lying about their age, who were 41 and 42, and they were saying, we don't need you, and those were the volunteers for the Home Guard. Yeah. But I think in the 70s it was probably cathartic to laugh about World War II finally.
I think it was. My dad loved it. For example, my late father, he just loved that show, and a lot of people do, because I think actually, one of the things that helped the British get through things is wit. There were a lot of there was a lot of joking around. It's amazing the people that said they were the best years of their life. My late mother-in-law was an American Army nurse, and she and my husband has said, she never wanted to upset us, her kids, but she often said those were the best years of my life. And she was working under enormous pressure in Britain. I think apparently during the Second World War, cases of mental illness went down because people were sort of pulling together. There was a common purpose. And as I was saying earlier, in a way, the British didn't need Churchill to urge them on to pull together and everything, because the nature of the character is that, when Hitler started bombing them, it was a case of, and it was terrible. But who do you think you are? We'll show you. There's quite a few rather risque songs that came up that I'm sure you're familiar with at the time.
Why me?
To Britain, and
maybe Barbara.
You were the era, but
I was a child.
Knocking off parts of Hitler's anatomy and things like that, which people were very keen on doing.
Well, the rumor is he did that himself or something, right?
Well, before anyone got to him.
Yeah, that's right.
But anyway, so you.
Well, I'm curious, before I talk about my book, is it daunting to go into a second war? Because Maisie Dobbs, as we all know, started in the First World War, and especially one that's been so well. I think about Philip Kerr just died, one of my very favorite writers, and I think the best historical fiction written in my lifetime about. You have a broader base of knowledge, but in my lifetime about World War II was the Berlin Noir, the original 3 Bernie Gunther novels. Was it daunting to go into such?
I think it would be fair to say it was daunting being in it, in the midst of writing. One of the things that I was interested in is how, and I think we all do this as writers, you ask your question, how would I feel if? And that's a question that comes to me a lot, you know, because I haven't lived through the periods that my characters, not just Maisie Dobbs, have lived through. So I have to ask myself, how would I feel if? And how would I feel if I had lived through one war where I had lost my innocence at a very young age, in the way that you lose your innocence when you see Death of a Terrible Kind? How do I feel now, knowing we're going into a second war, another war? And so I try to think, how did my grandparents feel when they saw, you know, their sons going to war? How did they feel? So that was a question. The other thing is knowing how, I would say, believe it or not, my mum more than my dad, and my dad was in the forces, but how the Second World War was a particularly dark time for her, even though, you know, she was a very up sort of person. But it, because of the things that happened to her, that I know that happened to her. So doing the research and doing the writing, I think that's going into a dark place, to tell you the truth. And when you write about war a lot, it's just, you always want to stop work and write a comedy, if you know what I mean. Write something funny. And I often do that just to lift you above where your research is taking you and where your writing is taking you. Because you're going to the heart of people's emotions when they're going through a difficult time, whatever face they might show to the world. And just to give you an example, when I'm talking about sort of my family, you know, my mother, she was evacuated with her siblings during the war, but even when she was back in London, she was 17 years old, 16 when she was buried under her house. A bomb dropped in the street, and she was always kind of claustrophobic. She didn't like being in enclosed space, and what she told me about that experience, you know, I mean, I absolutely could see everything that she described. And then that moment when the bomb hit, and 1 minute she was watching she was ironing her brand new, she saved up her clothing coupons for this new shirt, this new blouse, and she was ironing it. And as she was ironing, she was watching the little girl across the street who had a crush on her brother play hopscotch. She turned around and put the iron blouse on top of the piano while she folded the ironing board, and as she turned back, boom, the next thing she knew, she was under rubble. And she remembered opening her eyes and seeing two things. The little girl across the road had gone, because the whole road had been blown up. And her blouse was torn to shreds on top of the piano, which was all blown to pieces. And the force of the bomb had blown off every stitch of her clothing. And the next thing she remembered was this big policeman taking off his greatcoat and wrapping it around her and saying, "It's all right, love, you're going to be all right." But she said she had all this dust up her nose and in her eyes and in her ears. And she said all she remembers about him was seeing his number on his greatcoat here. And so, you know, when you're thinking of, I think of those things, my mum and dad's stories, when I'm writing, and I might not put their story into my book, but I'm trying to get into the period, into how would I feel if. Is that?
I think that's so sharp, because people always get up at the end of readings and they say, is this autobiographical, or is this... And I don't think it's ever that direct. It's just I don't know. There's a great Haruki Murakami, he answered the question. He said, I like to imagine my protagonist and I are twins, and at birth we were separated. And he was sent to the other side of the country, and I stayed where I was, and he became, you know, an accountant or a method. The ways that autobiography works into fiction are so much more complicated than just Maisie is based on my mother, or Charles Lennox. Exactly. But the emotional timbre of the books is probably based on our own lives. I mean, that's an incredibly moving story, and yet it probably worked its way into the book in subtle ways.
I think it's the knowledge of what lingers, what remains, and this question, how would I feel if, I remember feeling very keenly. There was a scene I wrote for Pardonable Lies all those years ago, and in it, Maisie has returned to France, and she is at the site of the casualty clearing station where she had worked, and she's in what they call a casualty clearing station cemetery. And there were 4 different types of cemeteries that were used in the First World War. There were what they called the public cemeteries. Early casualties were just buried in the French cemeteries. And then there were the battlefield cemeteries, which you actually see on the former battlefield. I mean, if you look up the Somme Valley, you can actually tell where no man's land is, because you see the cemeteries there, and there's the cross of sacrifice, which was designed by Edwin Lutyens. And
so that's how you say that. I've always wondered.
Yeah, and then I might get it wrong. I might get it wrong. That's how I pronounce it. And then there's what they call concentration cemeteries, where a lot of the remains were all brought to one place. A lot of the big American Second World War cemeteries are what they call concentration cemeteries. All the graves are concentrated in one place. And then there were the casualty clearing station cemeteries, where these are all the people that died in the casualty clearing station or whatever. And I went to a casualty clearing station cemetery. And there's it's really interesting, because it was one of those days when the weather was just like soldiers described it in the First World War. You know, that slanting rain, never ending across Flanders. And it was one of those days. It was bitterly cold, and it was April. And you had to walk down a little alleyway, and it was just a very small cemetery. Some of them are not big, they're sort of a fraction the size of this room. And I was just looking at, and I saw the graves of some doctors that had died when it came to attack, and I'd already written that Maisie's casualty clearing station had come under attack. I didn't know there actually was one that had, but here I was. And it was one of those days, and I had to ask myself, how would I feel if I was a young woman in sort of early 30s, and this is where I lost my innocence, seeing this death? How would I feel if, and I remember thinking, I would fall to my knees. I would fall to my knees. And I wrote that scene in Pardonable Lives. And so I think it's kind of where you need to go. And it's kind of where you need to go, I think, in a lot of scenes in any book, whether it's a comedy, whether you're writing comedic work, or a mystery, or whatever you're writing, thriller, drama, that's where you go.
Well, this is interesting, so I write mostly about the 1870s and 1880s, and occasionally I'll feel a pain of a protectiveness or something about these characters, because they have no idea what's... It's like dramatic irony, which is where the audience knows something that the characters do not. And we know what's coming next. And there's that great Barbara Tuchman book about how there was no time, people reminiscing about 1905 and 1906, and how they had no idea what was coming, and how they thought they had arrived at the end of history. They had this wonderful sewage system, and what was the name of that great prime minister who rode his tricycle to Parliament from Downing Street? It's Lord, starts with a G. Anyway, I mean, it was this crazy...
Oh gosh.
Does anyone remember? No.
It'll come to me sort of like 10 o'clock tonight.
Okay, just text us all when it comes to you. Anyway, so, I mean, there's that famous story about the patent director for the U.S. Patent Office in 1900 who said, this office should be disbanded because everything's been invented. I think 4 years later, the Wright brothers were taking off. So I feel that about these characters, that, my characters, I feel a sense of, I don't know, I have them talk sometimes about, what will it be like when we're 80? It'll be 1920, and it breaks my heart a tiny bit, because these characters are so alive to me, and, I've written 11 books about them now. Yeah, it's an interesting crux of history. The 20th century, we're still coming to terms with the brute fact of it. I mean, I think it's still so...
Well, it's interesting, because it's I can remember going to it was at the end of 1999. Peter Jennings wrote a book on, I think it's called The American Century, or The Century.
Mm-hmm.
There were two with very similar titles. One was by Harold Evans.
Was it The Greatest Generation?
No, it wasn't The Greatest Generation. It was about the 20th century. It might even be called the century. I listened to him talk, and he said the 20th century started in 1914. because that was really, you know, there was so much sad to say, with war comes innovation. Particularly medical innovation, with all sorts of innovation. I mean, the first IVs used were in the battlefields of Flanders. Marie Curie actually ran a mobile, she and her daughters ran, trained women to run mobile X-ray units, and things like that, were things that had not been done before. The roots of plastic surgery, and da-da-da-da. And so there was so much innovation, and unfortunately the innovation of weaponry is always a step ahead of the innovation of medicine. So that was really interesting to me, and then you think of everything that happened, as you've just said.
Well, I think
and it's right through the Cold War and onwards.
Do you know the great Virginia Woolf quote on or about October 1st, 1910, human character changed forever? Which is so, on or about is so Virginia Woolf. I love that. Maybe it was October 3rd, maybe it was, but I think it's the same idea that they saw maybe that something was stirring that they couldn't handle.
Well, it's also, as you know, people think globalization is something new, but Niall Ferguson said the First World War ended the first great age of globalization. Well, I don't know that it was the first great age of globalization, because for a start, the British were trading since before the Middle Ages. You know, the Chinese were. When did the Silk Road come in? But definitely, it's through the spanner in the works there, and also arguably, you know, was the root cause of a lot of the conflict, because all of those trading agreements, it's just like trading agreements now. You have to look at the small print. They should look at the small print, because a lot of those trading agreements...
Thankfully I'm Arabian, so I do not have to look at the scroll.
had agreements to come to the aid of, in the case of war. That's why Britain came to the aid of France in the First World War. I mean, it was all there in trading agreements. And so on, and so you saw all the alliances fall down like that.
You want to change? Your microphone's buzzing. Try mine.
Is that better?
Yes.
Oh, good. Well, now I have nothing to say.
So let's fall back, because you've written 11 books about Charles Lennox, but this is the one where you go back and write it before he became the Charles Lennox that we met in your first book.
Exactly. So I wrote these 10 books that are set between 1865 and 1875, and he's roughly, you know, maybe 36 to 46 during that period. And this book is set in 1850. And I was just feeling, I said to Jackie a little bit earlier, you know, writing a series, I asked her how she does it, and it's such an intimate experience with the characters, because for a reader it's maybe 2 or 3 days a year you spend with those characters, but for the writer you're with them all year long. And it's a long journey at close quarters. It's like you're sharing a cabin at sea.
Give me a break at times. You know?
Yes, and I understand why people kill off characters. I don't. Sometimes you're just like, Jesus. So I felt that a little bit of that restlessness, and I said to my very generous and kind editor, you know, I can do this. It's like poaching an egg. Like, I can do it if I have to and write an 11th book, but I just feel the need to do it. And he said, well, why don't you just brainstorm about what to do? And I sort of, we started talking about a prequel, and I got so excited about the idea of writing about this character I've only known for a certain period of his life, when he was 23. And he's, in the book, he's new. He's just directly from Oxford to England, and he's so far a total failure as a detective. And he has this one chance, which is a cold case of an unmarked body that washes up on one of the many little islets in the middle of the Thames in a naval trunk. And so he has to try to trace it back to its origin, and it leads into all of these proliferating mysteries. But the real joy, I think you and I might be different, because the real joy for me in writing historical fiction is, you know, I go back and I read the books that inspired the series in the first place, which are Middlemarch and Sherlock Holmes, and the atmosphere is what's so important to me, and I think your research is much better than mine. I think is the research where it begins for you?
Is the research
or is it the atmosphere?
It depends, and it's usually a bit of both. It's where are we going to be next, and then there are things that I know that I need to know that I don't know. And I usually, when I go through that process, I find out all sorts of other things. I think, wow, that's really interesting, and I can so easily go off in little paths.
Sure.
But I sort of bring, particularly now we're in the Second World War, bring together what I know were sort of family experiences. Not that I write about my family, because I don't, but there are little snippets here and there, just that will only be a sentence, which I know will perhaps anchor the book in its time and give a sense of time and place. The sort of things that you don't read in books.
Exactly.
They're little snippets, and that's why I like to read. And my research isn't just books; it's newspapers, and the little things you come across in a newspaper.
I do the exact same
Are
thing.
just terrific.
Yeah, they're amazing.
And so it also gives you an anchor for what they might be reading as well. I mean, Billy Beale is one of these characters that will come into the office, and we've all met them. Have you read what's in the paper today? Boom, flings down a paper and goes off on a tangent about somebody. And great,
Well, for my era, it's amazing because all the ads are for medicines where the first 4 ingredients are heroin, cocaine, alcohol. I mean, it's like bound to cure your baby's colic, and it's like, well, no shit.
It was actually for, birds of a feather. I did quite a lot of research into cocaine without actually taking cocaine.
That's what she says.
I read this terrific book on cocaine that was just, I just was glued to this book. It was so interesting. And the guy that wrote it was actually, it was a very detailed book. You should look it up, it's terrific. But he was also very funny because he sort of also wrote, if you will, the story of his research. And just as an aside, he was doing this research, and he had found some very old papers going back to the 1700s by some famous author, but it was all about cocaine. And he started feeling, getting a bit spacey and various, let's say, feelings that he didn't normally have. And he realised he was probably one of the only people that ever delved into this particular archive. And he came out stoned. The guy was obviously, while he was writing, was stoned on cocaine. And, but even in the First World War, you could buy heroin at Savoy and More.
Of course.
And people were encouraged to buy heroin or whatever to send to their loved ones, so they had something in case they were.
Nothing says
injured.
I love you.
Yeah. and of course, a lot of soldiers came home absolutely hooked on morphine because they didn't know how to dose them.
Right.
And then they had to go cold turkey, and it was the Canadian soldiers that initially readily had access to cocaine, and they're the ones that started calling it snow.
Interesting.
In the First
Let's
World
be
War.
fair and recognize that up until
cocaine.
really the 19th century, that pain relief in Western Europe was almost entirely from alcohol. People drank gin, or if you had, do you remember did any of you watch the Addams, John and
Oh yeah, the
right, and
miniseries.
their daughter had a mastectomy for cancer in 1790 or something. And there was no pain relief for her for that surgery. The best you could do was to get people drunk. If they amputated them, like Nelson and his sailor, they would pour rum into them and the whole bit. So when along came these miraculous substances, that allowed you to have some pain relief, people didn't. They embraced it without recognizing that it could lead to other stuff. But I mean, there was a major drug habit in Europe and in America. All those patent medicines that they were. I mean, Coca-Cola was actually called Coca-Cola for a reason. And we now think we know better, but then, why would you not?
Do you know, to this day, Coca-Cola are the biggest and only registered importer of the coca plant into the United States.
You're kidding.
No.
Oh.
And they have to extract what used to be in there.
Right.
I found that out reading that book about cocaine. It was really
Are you the publicist for this book?
I will now admit that
Here we
going
go.
to Peru,
This is
There we go.
if you are in Cusco, Peru, and if you are staying in one of the high-end hotels, they give you coca leaves and
Oh
coca
my
tea
God.
because it helps you breathe
Yes.
at that altitude.
Oh, that's
And
interesting.
they even make it into candy. It's green candy called coca candy and whatever, but it's actually for I'm luckily a non-addictive person except for books. I'm able to survive virtually all other addictions, so it's never bothered me. But I've often wondered if some, tourists who've been drinking coca tea at the monastery in Cusco, which is like this luxury hotel and so forth, whether that knocks them out, for a long time afterward or develops the problem.
I have a friend who teaches creative writing, and she said, I know none of these kids are doing drugs. And I said, how do you know that? And she said, I got a story the other day that started, the scent of cocaine wafted up the stairs. I laughed. I said, I think that person maybe doesn't have first-hand experience with cocaine.
So in Charles's book, I think it's really important, we discussed this earlier, to get the context. In 1850, the police force in England, the bobbies, had only been going for 18 years. It was formally established in 1832. Before that, there were Bow Street runners, the kind of people who populate Regency novels and so forth, but they were kind of cops for hire and not necessarily always on the side of the law. Sometimes they had little side action.
Virtually never, yeah.
Yeah, right. So Charles is coming along. Charles, it's so hard. He's Charles. That's why I call him Charlie, to try to distinguish between him and Charles Lennox, the character. He's trying to establish himself as a detective at a time when that was virtually unknown.
That's exactly right. Well, so this was, I like to latch onto a little piece of research and dig really deeply into it. And what fascinated me this time was I came across, I was saying this earlier, a statistic that someone in the book says, how many murders do you think there were in England in the year 1810? And she says, I don't know, maybe 5,000. And Charles Lennox, the hero, says, actually there were 9. And she says, 9,000. And he says, no, 9. And that's because there were 9 reported murders in England in the year 1810. For most of the 18th century, the law enforcement was actually the criminals, like Jonathan Wild, the famous thief-taker. They would make a bargain with the criminal courts. The assizes would go around the country and hear a magistrate. It was all very ad hoc. And at the same time as so they're called bobbies because their founder was Sir Robert Peel, and they were also called peelers, and they were extremely loyal to him. They really were the best and the brightest. But at the time of this novel, they were still only 18 years old, this police force, and they were still sort of becoming professional. France already had a sort of professional police force. And the idea of a private detective did not exist in any way. And I wanted Lennox to be at the center of a few different vectors, one of which is there's this new police force. One of which is there's this idea that we as a society should have law and order. The last public hanging in Britain was in 1850, and 40,000 people went. And one of the reasons that it was the last public hanging is because Charles Dickens wrote an incredibly impassioned letter which got circulated as a pamphlet that was like, this is vile, we shouldn't do this anymore. So there were these first glimmers of a civil society, and at the same time there was a huge rise in the popularity of what were called penny bloods, and which later became called penny dreadfuls. And at the time that this book takes place, 1850, the most popular by far was one called Sweeney Todd. And 7 out of 10 Londoners at the time, and probably 5 out of 10 Britons, at a time when the population was, say, 30 million, so 15 million people, read it, and virtually all of them thought it was real. So people stopped getting haircuts, people stopped eating pie, people stopped... And so they had to publish this huge thing that's like a fictional account of a horrifying... But so this was all in the air. The idea of a police force, the idea that maybe we shouldn't hang people in public. I always think of the fact that when Queen Victoria came to the throne, it was still the law in England that a suicide had to be buried at a crossroads when they staked through its heart. So there were these embers of the medieval age, and there were also these sparks of modernity. And so I wanted to write about that nexus, and that was what really made the book come alive for me. I have to find some kind of way into the time of each book, and that was it this time around.
For one of my books, I did some research on the River Police, and they were the oldest police department in London,
Right.
which always fascinates me. Always fascinates me about the River Police. But then the terms, what you were saying about naval police, the docks, it was the lifeline to the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's what Anne Perry writes a really interesting series about William Monk, and he in fact moved over to the river police, and it's fascinating the jurisdiction that went on.
Well, and the reason there was a river police is because there was so much money at stake. Nowhere else, and if you got murdered in the Seven Dials, no one really cared. But if your shipment of saffron got stolen, it was a big deal. So the shipping companies got together and hired these, what were called raw lobsters, because they wore these blue uniforms. And they had to carry 15 pounds of stuff. It was like a whistle, a flashlight, everything under the sun. So.
Plus it was a globalized deal. I mean, we think of globalization as a modern thing, but it was pretty globalized in the mid-Victorian era.
Right.
And the Thames was really the artery of British trade. The pools and the docks and all that.
You only have to look at old photographs and paintings of that era and the docklet, they call docklands today, and the big warehouses and so on. I mean, I can remember many years ago going into one of those warehouses, and apparently when they were first converted to apartments, you could still smell the spices in the brickwork. I mean, you can't take away 1,000 years of trade just like that. There was still that aroma in the area. And actually I can remember, because my family comes from London, my extended family, and it was, my gosh, 30 odd years ago, someone telling me to meet them at South Docks Marina. And I said, well, after South Docks Marina, I thought I knew London. And when I looked at the A to Z, and got there, and when I got there, I said, why didn't you just say Rotherhithe Docks? And it's just like, well, it's not called that anymore. It's only South Docks Marina, all very posh, but it's a really fascinating area, fascinating history.
The single most dangerous place was Canary Wharf, which is now all hedge fund managers. It's still dangerous, someone said? Even more dangerous.
I was actually at Canary Wharf a few weeks ago. It's really funny you should say that. Why was I there? Oh, yeah, shopping.
For a hedge fund manager?
So before we open up to questions, I had one I wanted to ask Jackie. When this young man, who's in a safe occupation because he's painting government facilities, and he's got two older brothers who've already...
He's got an older brother and older sister.
Right, but his older brother's already joined up.
No, his older brother is also in a protected position.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, the young man really, here he is in this protected thing, and so he's got this mixture of stuff, and he's out slathering it on various government buildings and so forth, and he's feeling increasingly ill. It's hard for him to breathe, he has terrible headaches and so forth. What was in this protective thing? Was this really sort of an asbestos thing going on, but we don't really call it that?
Not asbestos, just to tell you the origin.
Right.
That, I guess I'd known for a long time that my dad, when he left school at 14, and in those days, your parents found you a job. You didn't just go out looking for it. You were told, you're leaving school, and this is where you're starting work on Monday. And my grandparents got my father an apprenticeship at a painting and decorating firm because they thought he will go on to be a master craftsman, and that's a good job. And in fact, my father did end up as a master craftsman. But I first got an inkling that something was different about what he had been doing, and it was actually when I was about 18, my brother was 14, just to digress here. We're not really digressing. We were, how, dare I say, all teenagers can say, oh God, you want me to do what? We'd parked the car, teenagers, and my dad parked the car, I was sitting in the front, and he turned around to my brother, gave him, some money, and said, and it was a store that my dad wanted something from, he said, quick son, nip over there and go in and ask for such and such. And my brother went, oh, and he just got out of the car and, dragged his feet across the road. And my dad looked and went, look at that. When I was his age, I was living away from home and doing doing this and that. I went, really? And before I could get any more out, and my brother was back and said, I also bought some ice cream. Or something like that. And anyway, sadly, it was only a few weeks before my father passed away. He was in the hospice, and I was spending a lot of time with him talking. And he started to tell me about this job. And that it was more or less as soon as war was declared. Well, he would have started in sort of 1940. That's when he was 14. And, figure that out. Yes, he was 14, 1940. That he was sent from place to place painting these airfields because the company had got a contract to paint aircraft buildings with a fire retardant. And they were putting up new aircraft buildings very, very quickly, plus what they called decoy airfields, because they knew that there would be a major attack by the Luftwaffe. And fire can be one of the most scary things, and it would go through a lot of those buildings like that. And he said to me, he said, you know, Jackie, he said, you should have seen this stuff. He said, and of course he's the apprentice, so he had to mix it, and he was the one that had to test it, and so on and so forth. He was just basically the gopher. And they didn't wear any protective clothing, no masks, no gloves, no anything like that. And he said, literally, he said, we'd finished doing a wall, and he said, I'd line up 4 blowtorches at full throttle against that wall, and he said, and they would have to go for about 3 or 4 hours. He said, then we'd take them away to see if it worked, whether it'd taken. And I said, so obviously it did. He said, Jackie, he said, there was not a mark on the wall. And I said, oh my gosh, that's amazing. What did they call it? He said, oh, it didn't have a name, it only had a number. And I thought, I bet that was something that they were testing. And in wartime, you know, sometimes they don't, you know, they won't go through all the process of testing, they just get stuff out there. I mean, I think we all know that, in whether it's guns, whether it's whatever it is. And so I knew straight away that someday there was going to be a story there.
Can I interject tangentially one of my favorite stories of Victorian England, which is sort of similar but less dark. That is an amazing story. But so one of the big things in the way you advertised in Victorian England was handbills, which were just called bills. And one of the most common jobs was to be a bill sticker, which is you had like a pail of paste, and then you would stick the bills up. And one day in the 1860s, Westminster Abbey posted a sign. They were sick of the bills being, and it said, bill stickers will be prosecuted. And someone wrote underneath, bill stickers is innocent.
That joke has gone through time.
It's new to many of us.
You'd see it on, they still use that, for example, when I was in college, bill stickers will be prosecuted, and people always wrote underneath it.
Free bill stickers.
Yeah, or fine. So where is bill stickers?
Yeah. When it started in Westminster Abbey, bill stickers is innocent. So whatever anonymous genius came up with that first joke.
I think we should take questions from the audience, and before I do that, Miles, are you here? I'd like to say goodbye to our Facebook audience and thank you for joining us. I forgot to welcome you, so my apologies, and now we will say farewell.
Finally.
It takes 45 seconds, and I learned the hard way that if I say something I shouldn't say in that 45 seconds, it comes back to honest. And one of the things I usually say is we turn off Facebook so that you guys have some privacy to ask questions so you won't be self-conscious about being on Facebook, but the people watching on Facebook really resent that. All right, so there we are. All right, so in any case, let's put you in charge. What was that?
I said I didn't know that was going to be on Facebook.
It's okay, you didn't say anything damaging.
Didn't know.
Just all that cocaine stuff. Go ahead. Very nice.
For Ms. Winspear, 2 questions. I know that may be greedy, but you get so many serious questions. I have 2 silly questions.
Oh, that's okay.
Disregarding the word maid, are you a maid of Kent? Or a Kentish maid?
I'm a Kentish maid.
All right.
There you go. I bet you don't know what he's talking about.
No.
It's the River Medway runs through Kent, and if you're born west of the River Medway, you are known as a Kentish maid or a Kentish man, and if you were born to the east of the River Medway, you were a man of Kent or a maid of Kent. So I was actually a Kentish maid.
The second question is, why did you pick syllabub?
Oh, I love syllabub. I love that, but you don't
That's
know why
a drink,
I asked that
right?
question.
Is that?
No, a syllabub is a dessert.
It's a
And
dessert.
it's usually made with it's cream and what they refer to as a sack. So either
That was delicious.
Sherry is known as a sack.
No, of
Deer
course,
is a
of
sack.
course.
Port is a sack. So
It's British Zabaglione is
yeah,
really what it comes
basically
down
it
to.
is.
Yeah.
And no, I love syllabub, and I very rarely indulge. So I was asked to submit a recipe to a book, a mystery writer's recipe book, and I wrote a syllabub. Have you tried syllabub?
There's the cook.
No, we haven't tried it yet.
Get a hold of some sack.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just Sherry. Right. All right. Another question.
Yes.
Oh, along the line of this gentleman's theme, I would like to compliment you on the way you present not only the emotional impact of the period that Maisie's going through. I think everyone is familiar with Maisie Dobbs. I think thinks of her as a real person and as a real friend, and if you ever kill her off. One of the side benefits of reading your book is learning that all these wonderful, I've always loved English biscuits and foods.
I will when it's finished. Yes.
But what I always do when I'm reading one of the Dobbs series is have a cuppa and some Eccles cakes.
The lady was pointing that when she's reading the book, she likes to have a cup of tea with some Eccles cakes, and as we all know, Eccles cakes are Maisie's favourite. Yeah, yeah.
But I think it's just great the way you bring in those little touches. We really learn more about the society.
Thank you very much.
Part of my ancestors come from England. I'm sort of an Anglophile, masterpiece theater junkie, etc. So it's just good to hear all these little details of the life of the eras that you're going through, and even the little goodies.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I've read, Charles, I've read all of your books, and I've also listened to all the audiobooks.
Oh, thank you so much.
And I love them all. But my question is, when you chose your narrator, James Langton, what type of process did you go through in order to choose your narrator? And did you have kind of a voice in your head that you wanted Charles to sound like before you even talked to any narrators?
The question was about audiobooks and what role the author plays, and I'd be curious what role you played, because you played zero role?
Yeah, in choosing a narrator, no.
Interesting.
I didn't choose a narrator.
Most authors don't have
I
any role in it.
I got 3 choices, and it was 3 men, and I would have preferred a woman, I think, but I think they thought because it was a male protagonist that it was, and I thought he was great, and then I listen to them sometimes and I have to turn it off because it's so different than it's the same way when I'm doing a reading, I sometimes will literally cross stuff out with a pen from the finished book because I'm like, oh, I messed this up. So I can't listen to them, but I'm glad that people like that. People love those what he does, and I think that's wonderful. Yeah, I think that's great. He's this sort of Shakespearean person.
There's a secret podcast, which will eventually become a public podcast, that Steve Berry did with his audiobook reader when he was here last Tuesday. And we gave people who bought Steve's book like a 30-day exclusive time to listen to it, but eventually we'll probably make it public. And they talk about many of the questions that come up. And Kevin and his audio person will be talking about that too. So I was really interested in how many people came, not because they read Steve Berry, but they were fascinated with the whole audiobook, the whole audiobook thing, which I think
This
is
person's
legitimate.
listening to one right now.
Right, right over there. All right, you're not
I
listening.
keep my book with me all the time.
You have your book around your neck all the time.
Someone
I love
came up
that.
to me and was like, I love your audiobooks. I listen to them on double speed. I was like,
There's a question way in the back. Can we hear you, ma'am? Is there a Maisie Dobbs series?
There isn't going to be a Maisie Dobbs television series. And don't be sad about it. Not for the foreseeable future in any case. And part of that is to do with, how can I put it? These things go through, let's say, phases of what people like. And at the moment, the British networks and so on, they're looking for contemporary, dark, dystopian type stuff. But apart from anything else, I'm so, you know, I actually think that the great thing is that there isn't a series in a way, because all of the time there isn't one. Then everybody has their own Maisie Dobbs and their own characters. We've all got imaginations, otherwise we wouldn't be able to read books. And when you're reading the books, you can see the character. And you can see the characters, and you see the characters in, you know, Charles's books and so on. And you have your own, they belong to you. Whereas as soon as you see something on the screen, it doesn't belong to any of us anymore. And everybody sees the same thing. And some people are going to be disappointed. Some are going to be, delighted. And I think it's just fine that it isn't on TV. You know, I think it's just fine. I'm perfectly happy with that. So no, not for the foreseeable future.
Yes, sir.
How did you come up with the idea of Maisie?
The question was, how did I come up with the idea of Maisie Dobbs? She found me. I was not planning to write fiction. I wasn't planning to write a mystery or anything like that. And literally, I had a J.K. Rowling moment. You know, she had 8 books came to her on the train between London and Glasgow or something like that. I had, literally, it was almost as if she walked into my life while I was stuck in traffic. Which was not pretty, because I was, stuck in traffic on a rainy day.
Where were you?
And I was just near where I live. I was stuck in raining, tail lights ahead of me. You know, everybody was stuck, and I just went off into one of my little daydreams. And this woman literally walked into my life, and and basically, when you read the first scene in the first book, Maisie Dobbs, that is what I saw unfolding. It was like watching a movie in my head. And then suddenly I heard all this honking. And I'm sure someone might have even yelled out, "Lady, are you waiting for any particular shade of green?" I will say that those moments, I've since referred to that as my moment of artistic grace. And those moments don't happen in a vacuum. I have been interested and curious about the era about which I write since I was a very small girl. Believe it or not, and it started with the questions I had about my grandfather. You know, why does he breathe like that? Why does his chest hurt? Why does he hurt when he walks? Why do we have to be quiet around him? And all those sorts of questions. And then, that childhood curiosity became an adult inquiry, and then I became really interested in how the lives of women in Britain especially changed with the Great War. And of course, when I was a child, those were the Miss this, Miss that, and Miss the other who lived on our street. And the women, the people that you knew in your community for whom there had never been a husband and children, but for whom there was a sepia photograph on the mantelpiece of a young man lost to war. And so it came as no surprise to me that Maisie Dobbs was from that era, and that she presented herself to me in that way. And then obviously things grew from there. And that's why I often say that, as she revealed herself to me and as I created the character, because I think in a way it's a two-way process. I think most writers believe that, because sometimes it's as if, they're revealing themselves to you, which I think is one of the wonderful things about a series, actually. You don't have to get to know that character in one book. The character can unfold in a much more natural way, just as you would make friends with someone. You don't get to know that person the first time you meet. You get to know them over time, and they reveal themselves to you. So that's how it works when you're writing a series. So does that answer your question? Probably more than you need.
Let's ask Charles that same question. Where did Charles Lennox come from?
I was tailgating Jacqueline in traffic. No, I don't have as eloquent an answer as that, so I'll let her answer stand.
Right. One more.
I have a question with Charles.
2 more. Actually.
I apologize, I didn't know who you were before.
Please leave.
But
He's a really great guy. So.
yes, so now I shall go get your book. Why did you choose that particular time frame in Victorian England?
Oh, good question. It was a good question that none of you can know. The question was, why did I choose this particular time frame? And the answer is, roughly, so when I was 12 or 13, I got for my birthday a huge leather-bound, very impressive-looking Sherlock Holmes, and I was so pissed off because it was obviously very expensive and also totally useless to me. I was like, this could have been a Nintendo. So finally, after a month or two, I opened it and I read, and it was like falling down a whirlpool or something. And I got to the I read it all in 2 or 3 days of summer reading. And I got to the last page and I went back to the first page. And after that, I must have read it 30 times. And then gradually my reading expanded out to include so many authors who I still love, like Anthony Trollope and Elizabeth Gaskell and George Eliot and I love her, and Wilkie Collins. And I lived in that world mentally throughout my teenage years. I'm not sure why. I think like everyone when they're a teenager, for some people it's Dungeons and Dragons, for some people it's, you know, being on the football team, and for me it was really British novels was what I loved the most and what was closest to my heart. And so I wrote one when I was 23, and now here we are.
There you are. There was somebody, was it you, somebody over here, or was you? I'm sorry.
Hi.
Let's finish with you.
Okay. I have read so many books. Birds of a Feather, I think, was one of my favorites, and I think I was fascinated, or maybe that's not the right word, of how women at that time, young women, were giving feathers to men who were not in uniform. What was your background on? I mean, how...
The question is about Birds of a Feather and about the young women who gave out white feathers. Interestingly enough, the two people behind that, the White Feather movement, were, one was, I can never pronounce her name, Baroness Hawksey,
Yes.
who wrote The Scarlet Pimpernel. And the other woman, her name has just gone right out of my head. It will come to me usually probably about 10 o'clock tonight.
Well, when you text us about the other thing,
I will. And they felt that young men not at the front were cowards. And so the White Feather movement was started. And young women were encouraged to give white feathers to young men who were seen not in uniform. One of the things that led to later was something called medical blues, which was a special uniform you wore if you were wounded in battle and you were no longer in the service because you were terribly wounded, because they made the error of going up to men who were wounded or shell-shocked or whatever. Not all wounds can be seen, and giving them white feathers. And also to young boys who maybe just happened to look a bit older than they were, which of course we know happens to Billy's younger brother. I first was very aware of that story, and it played in my mind from the age of 10 when one of our teachers told us the story. And he had been a boy he was a teacher that had retired and came in. He was getting on, and he had been a boy at that time, and on a bus, and had seen a young woman with a feather give that feather to a young man not in uniform. And he turned around to her, and all this side of his face had been blown away. And she scurried off the bus. And that just, I was telling you, it broke my heart. And so it was going to turn up in a book. You know, I think actually I ended up writing about all the things that moved me, to tell you the truth. But thank you for asking that question. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, we have come to the moment where we like to thank all of you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.